to you what is on this chart that is called chart number 3, dimensions of the ecliptic for all systems. And there's a couple of little boxes to the right that said observe gradual extension of AA until axis of cone of which AA is base disappears into one plane of ecliptic. In each octave, the universal constant expresses itself by a contractive inhalation followed by an expansive exhalation. And it shows in the middle part of this the cone of the ecliptic. And in its first position is the second part, and in the second position is the third part there, and the third position and the fourth position. The factors which primarily determine the substance of matter are the dimensions of the ecliptics, planes, and pressures of the atomic systems. As ecliptics contract from spherical nebulosity to spiral in one plane, like a disk, pressures increase. Also, centripetal and centrifugal forces increase. This is chart number 3, structure of the atom, diagram of the 4 positions in which the universal constant distributes its energy into 4 unit constants of 7 tones each, one appearing to be a separate substance due solely to changing dimension. Now to continue from where I left off in the last video, there is but one position in the universal machine in which the wheels run parallel in plane without intersection, without precession, and without eccentricity. In this position in the atom, or its repetition in larger masses, there are no equinoxes, no ascending or descending nodes, and no aphelons or perihelons. This is the element carbon, where inhalation ends and exhalation begins, where instability and the illusion of stability are at their maximum. There are cone and disc clutches in the universal machine, which grasp and slip with the same relative persistence and looseness with which man is perfectly familiar in his mechanics. These qualities give us relatively rigid bodies, such as this dense planet, the more dense Sun, pithy Saturn, and vaporous Neptune. These qualities give us the same relative rigidities in the elements, such as carbon in the diamond, and less dense substances down through the solid metals and metalloids in their gaseous expansions in such elements as hydrogen and its mate haloanon. The contours of the cone clutches, which give great surface tension pressure, contract toward the poles, disappearing in the axis and gravitative centers of all masses. The disc clutches which slip are the contours of expanding cones. These lose their ability to hold as the cones expand into disappearance at the equatorial planes of all masses. Stability in motion is, therefore, greatest at the centers of all masses, and superficially at their poles. On the contrary, instability in motion is greatest at the equators of all masses. As a consequence, rigidity in all mass is greatest at its poles where the cone clutches hold, and flexibility is greatest at its equators where the disc clutches slip. So they hold and they slip. The cone clutches at the poles of the sun, of our solar system, for example, hold fast. That is why the expanded magnetic basis of the equatorial belt of the sun moves faster than the contracted polar magnetic basis. That is also why the equatorial belt of the sun is hotter than the polar zones. The slipping of the oppositely moving disk generates much heat. This explains the boiling bubbles which we call sunspots, which move nearer to the equator of the sun and further away again in oppositely whirling spiral pools during each 11-year breathing period of the sun. That is why the corona of the sun extends so far into interstellar space at its equator, and so much less so at its poles. That is how, and one reason why, another planet will soon be born to the already pregnant sun. That is why Jupiter has its belts and Saturn the rings, which Jupiter will also have when his axis tilts a little further to change the bevel gearing of his wheels. That is why Uranus and Neptune are reversing their poles. That is why nature added the gyroscopic principle to her mechanics of motion in order to create the illusion of stability in her corpuscular solids of motion. That explains the isoclinal lines, that's spelled ISOCLINAL. That explains the isoclinal lines which run around this planet, forming new bases for the expanding cones of radiation, like the rim of the umbrella, which gradually opens until it's in one plane. That is why all masses emanate magnetic lines of force at isoclinal lines and regenerate them by absorption at the poles. That is why the compass needle loses its dip on the zero isoclinal line, which roughly follows the geographic equator, and swings its north pole to the south magnetic pole south of that line, and to the north magnetic pole when proceeding north from it. Motion is an appearance born of the axis of a conceptive cone in inertia. It assumes the appearance of an expanding cone and disappears through radiation in equatorial opposition. The universal machine is a gyroscopic top. When it is in little motion, its form is a cone, like a top, gyrating unsteadily on an eccentric axis. When it is in great motion, it loses the altitude and eccentricity of its axis and becomes a gyroscope revolving steadily in one plane. The generative attractive principle is the principle of contracting cones. All mass is generated and regenerated by a contractive pressure exerted in the direction of its gravitative center. Its minimum of generated pressure is exerted from its equatorial plane and its maximum pressure from its pole. The radiative repellent principle is the principle of expanding cones. All mass is radiated and diffused by an expansive pressure exerted in the direction of its surface. Its minimum of radiative pressure is exerted from its pole and its maximum from its equatorial plane. By arranging the elements in the orderly positions of their relative stability and instability, as in the accompanying chart, the chemist can work out his problems much more simply upon paper than by experimenting in the laboratory without the knowledge of this orderliness.